There's a pattern that repeats itself in almost every company. The strongest performer on the team starts to disengage. They stop offering ideas. They stop challenging things. They deliver solid work, on time, with nothing extra. And when they finally hand in their resignation, everyone says the same thing. We never saw it coming. But the truth is more uncomfortable than that. It's not that nobody saw it coming. It's that the warning signs were there for months, and no one knew how to read them, because recognizing them would have meant having to do something about them. Organizations don't lose their best people overnight. They lose them little by little, one signal at a time, through a process with clearly identifiable stages, if someone knows where to look. The problem is that almost nobody is looking where they should. Think about someone you know, or about yourself at some point in your career. Someone who, for years, was the first to bring new ideas, the last to give up when something wasn't working, the person everyone turned to when things got difficult. Then, at some point, that's hard to pinpoint exactly, that energy started to shift. Not dramatically, just gradually, almost imperceptibly. The ideas stopped coming as often. The questions during meetings became less frequent. The work was still outstanding, but something different had started happening beneath the surface. That shift has a name, and it has stages. The first stage is active frustration. This is the period when the person still believes the system can respond. They still make suggestions, still ask hard questions, still point out what isn't working. The signs at this stage are easy to recognize. They ask uncomfortable questions in meetings, suggest improvements that no one ever implements, and request conversations about their professional growth that keep getting pushed back indefinitely. There's energy in that frustration. There's hope embedded in it. The problem is that this behavior is often perceived as being difficult rather than deeply committed. Instead of being recognized as a sign of high potential, it starts being managed as a source of friction. And that's exactly what pushes them into the second stage, passive disengagement. The moment the person realizes that saying what they really think comes with a political cost, they're no longer willing to pay. At this stage, the indicators change completely. They stop asking uncomfortable questions. They stop making suggestions. They deliver exactly what's expected of them, with the same level of quality as always, but without the extra initiative that used to come naturally. From the outside, they're still an outstanding employee. On the inside, they've already started building something else. Managers often mistake this stage for improvement, as if the person had finally settled down, when in reality, it's the clearest sign that the exit process has already begun. The third stage, the quietest and the most advanced, is strategic indifference. At this point, on some internal level, the person has already decided that their future isn't with that organization. The indicators are the hardest to detect precisely because they're absences rather than visible behaviors. They stop using we when talking about future projects. Instead of saying, "We're planning to," they say, "The company is planning to." They stop asking questions about long-term initiatives because they're no longer interested. They stop speaking up in the spaces where they used to be the first to contribute. They operate with an emotional distance that only becomes noticeable in casual conversations, in the tone of someone observing an organization from the outside, even though they technically still belong to it. That distance is invisible to conventional performance tracking systems, but it's completely obvious to anyone paying attention to the right signals. And here's the reversal almost nobody talks about. Most managers assume the person most likely to resign is the one who complains the most. In practice, the opposite is often true. Complaining requires hope. It requires believing that speaking up might actually change something. The person who no longer believes that doesn't complain. They simply leave. And while that person stays quiet, someone with weaker results but more visible frustration keeps speaking up in meetings, keeps creating the friction that draws attention, keeps occupying mental space for the people managing the team. Without intending to, the system pays more attention to the person making the most noise. And the loudest person is rarely the most valuable one. This isn't a problem of individual perception. It's a direct consequence of how attention is distributed inside organizations. The warning systems are designed to detect declining performance. They're not designed to detect emotional disengagement in someone who continues producing at the exact same level. And that's the precise gap through which the hardest to replace talent quietly slips away. When the resignation finally comes, the impact the company calculates is usually incomplete. They estimate the time it will take to fill the role, the cost of recruiting, the onboarding period for the new hire. What never makes it into those calculations is the informal knowledge that leaves with the person. Who actually makes decisions inside the organization, and how? Which client has which communication preferences that were never documented? Which project almost failed and how it was saved? None of that knowledge exists in a database. It exists inside the person, and when that person leaves, it disappears. The relationships they built with other departments, clients, and vendors disappear too. Relationships that consistently produced results no one ever recognized as organizational assets because they simply existed. In highly complex roles, it rarely takes less than a year for someone new to rebuild that. That doesn't show up in any HR budget either. But there's something important worth saying directly to anyone who's in that third stage, quietly considering leaving. The moment you've already made the decision internally, but haven't announced it yet, is the moment you have the greatest negotiating power you'll ever have in that professional relationship. You're still inside the organization. You still have context they need. You still have the opportunity to put into words what's happening before the situation becomes irreversible. Not so you can stay at any cost, but so you can understand whether there's anything real that changes the equation. And if there isn't, so you can leave with greater clarity and more options than if you simply disappear. That conversation requires precision. It isn't a complaint. It isn't an ultimatum. It's a clear statement of what you need and what isn't happening. Something as direct as, for some time now, I haven't been getting the level of exposure I need to keep growing, and I need to understand whether that can change or whether we're reaching a natural limit. That sentence doesn't accuse anyone. It doesn't dramatize the situation, but it opens a conversation that can't be answered with another vague delay because you've identified the issue with too much clarity. And whatever answer you receive is information. If there's genuine willingness to change something, the conversation will lead to concrete commitments with real timelines. If there isn't, the response will simply be another version of the same vague promises you've already heard before. And that's information too, because then you know exactly what you need to know to make your decision, without guilt, without wondering whether things might have been different if only you had spoken up. Something happens remarkably often right after someone leaves a company where they spent too long in that third stage. About a month after leaving, they almost always describe the same experience. Not just relief, although that's part of it. Clarity. A very specific kind of clarity about how long they had been operating on autopilot, making decisions out of inertia instead of genuine choice, maintaining a situation they already knew had no future simply because they had never said the boundary out loud. That delayed clarity is one of the quietest costs nobody talks about. It never appears in a resignation letter, but it determines how long it takes someone to regain confidence in their own judgment after ignoring their own signals for months. When a high performer leaves quietly, it isn't because the company didn't value them. It's because the company never knew how to show that they were valued in the way that actually mattered. That distinction between being valuable and feeling valued is exactly what separates organizations that retain talent from those that consistently lose it without ever understanding why. The silence you're feeling right now isn't indifference. It's accumulated information waiting for a decision. The person who acts on that information in time leaves with leverage and with options. The person who waits until there's nothing left to negotiate simply leaves. And the difference between those two paths is built right here, in the moment when there's still something left to say. If you want to keep learning how to recognize what organizations will never explain to you out loud, this is the place to do it.